The situation currently taking place in Myanmar is abominable. There is no safety anywhere, and the world has all but turned its back on an entire people trying to claim their freedom and insist upon their human rights in the face of blatant evil and inhumanity. International media seems to have moved on to the next story, scarcely reporting on this one anymore, even as the horror continues. We at Insight Myanmar Podcast find this intolerable, and we stand behind the Burmese people in their courageous effort to live in dignity. This platform is dedicated to making sure that we keep the conversation going, while ensuring these voices continue to be heard. Today's guest is one of those voices, and I invite you to settle in and open up to what follows. I'm back with Jonathan Crowley here for another interview exploring his own spiritual journey, as well as learning about the things he encountered about meditation and spiritual bypass and Goenka organization, and getting just now into Burma. So after all the hours of conversation we had, as I joked on the end of the last episode, that here on Insight Myanmar Podcast, we are finally getting into the subject of Myanmar. So Jonathan, thanks for coming back to talk about your extended experiences of being in Myanmar.
Yeah, thanks so much, Joa. And of course, a lot of this is wrapped up in our time together there, at least for me. You were there much longer, but you were hugely responsible for bringing Carolyn and I to Myanmar. And I think that began kind of a new, in some ways, a new chapter around our relationship with the organization and the tradition of SM Goenka.
Yeah, so before we get into your visit in Myanmar and what you learned from that, I think it's helpful to just examine your vision of what Myanmar was before you got there. And I think that one thing that listeners have heard me talk quite a bit about, whatever the subject or the guest happens to be, and in fact, this is probably one of the reasons why I was motivated to want to start this podcast platform, is that for decades and even for centuries, Myanmar has been, I would say, a victim of Orientalist thinking, of exotification, of people wanting to see in the country and culture and even religion what kind of trying to describe and to depict what they see more according to what they want to see than what's actually on the ground. And there's been extensive literature about Orientalism in the world, with, of course, starting with Edward Said describing Egyptian literature, moving on to India, and then certainly Burma. And I've certainly encountered that in my own extensive time there, in terms of the biases and things that I had to clarify in my own thinking and understanding, to a greater understanding of what was really taking place. And it's something that I see in the way it's depicted in news reports and Facebook posts by travelers going through, and so much else. And so going back to specifically looking at the role that Myanmar plays within the Goenka organization, how it's described, how meditators and teachers talk about it and think about it, I think that would be really helpful to know that kind of imagery and that kind of mindset that one has even before setting foot on it based on the culture of the organization?
Yeah, yeah. Well, definitely my perceptions were very, influenced, conditioned, framed, shaped by what I heard, from Goenkaji, both in his 10-day courses where he describes his teacher, Sayagyi Bakin's center, in a few scenarios that happen there. And, certainly throughout my years involved with the tradition, I came to sort of, have this sense that, yeah, well, this is kind of where the practice of vipassana was preserved, in some ways much more, let's just say, in a much more pure form than, say, it was preserved in Sri Lanka or Thailand or other so to speak, Southern Buddhist countries and schools that, and so there was this kind of elevation of Myanmar as a place that really, preserved the pristine purity of the Dhamma. And I think that phrasing right there, it both attracted me to go. So I actually went there as a tourist for 1 month in 1997. And I only had a month. I went on a very much of a tour that was shaped by Goenkaji's tradition and the chain of teachers. So we visited the main sites of, Goenka's new center, Sayagyi Bakin's center, Sayatechi Center, and Lady Sayadaw Center, up in the north, as well as I think also the monastery of Webu Sayadaw, who is connected to the tradition in significant ways. And so that was my previous, so going there, and it was very much framed around that chain of teachers as my experience of the Dhamma. Of course, I was aware that, that Myanmar held many traditions of Vipassana, of the Dhamma, many, stories of monks and nuns who were enlightened. There's obviously, hundreds, if not thousands of monasteries in Myanmar. Don't have the exact number there, but, but yeah, so that, but I also think, just to your point, the relative isolation of Myanmar contributed to sort of this, this sort of pure land of Dhamma, that I think feeds into some of those, the sort of neocolonial and Orientalist, sort of this, like, it was almost like a holdout, right, for a lot of those attitudes, because it hadn't been really as touched. I mean, maybe this could be argued, but it hadn't been as touched by modern society and modern globalism as other Southern Buddhist countries had.
Absolutely. And that's where this irony comes, that this kind of untouched, pristine, traditional form of Buddhism, which is being promoted and touted by the way Goenka describes it, probably some other Theravada Buddhist traditions as well, maybe Mahasi, I'm not sure so much, but it also happens to be what the Dhamma itself is saying. And in no way am I suggesting collusion between the nationalistic propaganda, hateful messages of the Dhamma and what Goenka was saying about his memories of Burma. In no way am I saying that there's some correlation between that. Indeed, I mean, that's the military's justification for why it's trying to rule the way it is to quote unquote protect Buddhism and protect it from the Muslims and protect it from the materialist Western influences and everything else. And that, I mean, this can go into a whole other conversation about how strong really is a faith that needs this kind of oppressive protection, where you have to limit the opportunities and the freedoms of all the people throughout the entire country. And only by doing so can a certain kind of spiritual practice survive, because it's in a vacuum where there's simply nothing else that anyone can possibly do in their life. If that's the way you're protecting something, I think you have to look at what it is you're protecting and how it might be able to adapt. And I think this is also the lessons of Lady Sayadaw, where when he was confronted with what he thought were very much existential challenges to Burmese Buddhism, he looked at how to adapt and modify the practice to take the roots of what he understood from his deep study and practice and bring it to a modern reality. And I think that that's a proper way to look at it, rather than having these state controlled oppressions and controls that kind of keep it on artificial life support.
Yeah,
So
and that's interesting. I mean, I'm just sort of drawing those connections a little bit now between the current, military, government, and what those the threat that Lady Sayadaw perceived at the time of the British Raj, in terms of how the Dhamma had to be protected both from missionary Christianity, and is that some of the lines that you're drawing?
Right. Eventually, after the death of the current the current head of the Sasana, the British rulers at the time did not appoint a new leader, which kind of left that was one vacuum. Another vacuum, obviously, was the king, who was deposed, and the royal court was
Right.
always responsible for the maintenance of the Sangha and the Tipitaka and so much else. And without this, how are they going to survive? And that's where Lady revolutionized the lay movement and being able to carry forward. And so really he worked with the cards he was dealt and the context of the situation he was given, and found a way to be able to draw on these past teachings and make them relevant for this age. And also he was such a wide reader, and learning about science and Christianity and so many other things, he was able to start talking about Buddhism with an understanding of modern science and technology and the way Christianity was being framed. And so it was really genius in the way that he was able to reframe this and make it relevant again, which is very different than a more closed-minded approach, which is saying that because this traditional is correct, we need to suck the oxygen and the growth out of everything else around it so that nothing get in to contaminate it. And it just lives in this closed, protected environment where no one can breathe, but at least things stay the same.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, and returning to Myanmar in 2011, it was at a moment when things were really opening up politically. At least it seemed at the time. I remember, Aung San Suu Kyi had been released from home imprisonment, and yet it was still, I think it was still sort of touch and go around even being able to speak her name in public, or say for example, with a taxi driver. But by the time we left Myanmar, in fact, I think on the very day, about a year later, she had been elected to parliament, which was just, a sea change at that time. But I know that I really wanted to return back to Myanmar, and my wife Carolyn was also really just to have an opportunity to experience the culture there. But certainly that's when you and I met, and the three of us began to have a lot of conversations at that time. And I remember, really kind of tuning into your orientation, because I had this sense that, just from, I think you'd already been there since 2007, I believe. It was clear that or at least my perceptions of you, was that I was coming in with this, very typical, I think, and I had already been an assistant teacher of this, that Goenkaji's Dhamma was the entire Dhamma, because there's a kind of a conflation, I think, that happens within the tradition around that, that I was sort of already, trying to, I guess, modify within myself. But coming to Burma really, showed me that there was a much broader scope of the Dhamma than just Goenkaji's tradition. And I think I saw you, or perceived you to be, in some ways, already, noticing that, seeing that, just in the sense that you had already had a great exposure to other monasteries, to other, traditions within Myanmar, and a kind of just a broader scope. And that, and I think that began a process for both Carolyn and I around sort of, chipping away or dissolving that conflation that the entire Dhamma was Goenkaji's Dhamma, and that it was the purest form of Dhamma.
Right. And as that started to chip away at it, the question I have is kind of like the psychological or emotional reactions that you had, because this is something I'm fascinated about. It's something that I definitely went through and have seen other people go through. I've also seen people not go through it. As we talked about on our last episode, there are certainly people that that kind of talking and framing just isn't really that relevant and doesn't really touch them in the same way as others. But for me, as I started to learn these things and to experience this wider scope of Dhamma and this conflation that was going on and this wealth of other traditions that were in Myanmar, as well as starting to see that some of the ways that things had been told to me on the course, whether they were the country and culture of Myanmar or Burmese Buddhism or the monkhood or the role of this tradition vis-a-vis others, that when I started to encounter the differences of what I was led to believe and had very much believed, it was very hard, emotionally, psychologically. I was there, I lived in Myanmar a long time. And so I'm a slow learner, and I resist things that could be fairly obvious to others. So I'm not taking any credit for, I think it's really just the duration of time, which eventually confronted me with having to go through a certain kind of process. But I'm wondering about how, as you were learning these things, just that emotional and psychological impact and inner journey as this learning was taking place, if any.
Well, and I think by the time we landed in Myanmar, I was aware of just certain pieces that we've alluded to already in some of our conversations around just a kind of a lack of emotional integration that I perceived happening within students within Goenka's tradition and within the representation of the tradition, the leadership of the tradition. And yeah, so I landed, I think, in Myanmar with some thinking around that already kind of happening. And I do remember, you and I had some conversations around that, but I think I was still very much kind of, on the perch, you might say, of I don't know, you might say, sort of defending the place of Goenka's tradition in the world. And because I had already been appointed an assistant teacher, and so I was representing on some level, although at this moment I think I'd stepped down when Carolyn and I were getting together. And so I was in a kind of it was a more informal interaction with the tradition. But yeah, I mean, I remember being it was happening, I think, on more visceral levels. I mean, Carolyn and I were really drawn, of course, to the pagodas, zaidis, and payas, in terms of just, we sort of fancied ourselves looking, tracking down some of the pagodas that had, what we thought were authentic relics. Again, I think there's probably a range of perceptions on that, but we were, and I think you took us around to a lot of pagodas, and we meditated there together, and just having these almost sort of visceral experiences of I don't know. I mean, this sounds maybe very esoteric, but this is how I felt. But I just felt that there was, just living in Yangon, it was like a vortex of Dhamma vibrations. I don't know if the Shredigan Pagoda was responsible for that, but it certainly was extremely inspiring to me to be there on that level, right? And I think I think that also really sort of played a role in experiencing, I don't know. I just had this very visceral sense of, something that Goenkaji talks a lot about, the forces of Dhamma, right? But here I was really experiencing that on a regular basis, just, sitting in pagodas most evenings of the week, and I think that, yeah. And then I also remembered we sat a 10-day at Goenkaji Center, but I wasn't drawn to going back there actually after the 10-day course. I mean, it was a wonderful 10-day course like many others, but I was actually, in fact, we were much more drawn to going to Saiju Bakin Center, which is also in Yangon. And sitting there, we found the vibration there just much more inspiring, much more profound. It just knocked our socks off to sit there,
Mm.
to be, I think, yeah. And so I just think that began a process of just broadening our scope of, and maybe redefining, and putting into perspective that Goenkaji's tradition was one slice of something much broader and bigger. And I think that kind of, I was sort of trying to grapple with that, because I think I had begun to see that, or internalize a messaging around that Goenkaji's practice, his tradition, the organization was, this harbinger of the rise of the second sasana of the Buddhist teachings. That it was the tide that was going to lift all other Dhamma boats, you might say, in the world, and so that was kind of coming under some examination while we were living in Myanmar for that 1 year. And I would say it really, things really shifted after we returned from Myanmar.
Yeah, I think it's interesting looking at coming to Myanmar and going to the Goenka centers. I mean, I think I've been to many and have had wonderful experiences, and other people have as well. I think there's a lot of value there. They're run a bit differently, and it can be very fascinating. I've had a lot of insights there. I definitely say I've attended military ceremonies where during the previous dictatorship, where military were actually going and presenting dana and kind of having their moment in the sun, which was definitely a bit odd. But in any case, I think when I would talk to friends that were coming to practice, and they'd come for like 3 weeks and spend like half the time at a center, I would kind of laugh and say, these Goenka centers are great, but they really are around the world. And it kind of seems to me like flying all the way to a beautiful beach resort and then wanting to spend half your time in the hotel pool when the ocean was just outside. Like, please go to the ocean. And I would say this, and this was not kind of a clever way to get them to want to be interested in other techniques. It was really like, you're in the land where this whole lineage came from. I mean, you could spend your entire time between, a week self-course in Injin Bin, and then some days at the Lady Sayadaw Monastery, and seeing the influences of Sayaju Baken and Sayataji and just all these other things that are out there that you can't do anywhere else in the world. And so really spend your time in practice here. I give that advice to so many people and then help them to find those places. But I think that that it's really coming in from that background into Burma. There's a lot of kind of deconditioning that needs to take place from life and culture and teachings in the Goenka Center. I mean, I think first of all, this is for many people that are practicing Goenka meditation. I think now less so than before when we were younger, but for a long period, it was really the only game in town. I mean, there really wasn't much else out there that was going to give you any kind of spiritual experience. And so it was, I think, by virtue of existing at the forefront before a lot of other spiritual opportunities and practice and teachings came along, by being the only game in town, it's just, it's kind of a take it or leave it attitude. And you come to just want to see the benefits of it and continue with the practice, which is so different than the kind of Buddhist playground you find in Myanmar. I think another issue, and this is something that came up a lot, is that a lot of the ways things are described in the 10-day discourse, there is simply no way to no easy way to be able to find out correct information on that. I think, and again, I think today there's a lot more resources. You can go online and there's a lot of discussions and forums and people who've talked about this. It's still hard because a lot of it's bunk. A lot of the people that are criticizing the organization and teachings are coming at it from a very aggressive and I would say pretty inaccurate angle of not really, just being very negative and not really being quite so accurate in their criticisms. But in terms of the Myanmar angle, when I would start to talk to people, they'd say, well, where can I read a book to learn more about what you're saying, where I can learn more about these contrasting views? And I would basically say, I don't know what book you can read. I mean, for me, this has been a multi-year long odyssey of conversations and travels, and sure, reading this or that, but reading this or that and putting it in the context I already have. And so that also poses this challenge. I think,
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think one of the things you uncovered, I believe, for me was a treatise around what Sayatechi was teaching, and I think that was pretty significant for me to read because it described, a practice where, and again, I was, the contrast to this notion that Goenka was teaching a pure and pristine practice that was the same with each, chain of teacher, going back as far as Lady Sayadaw, came into question as I began to read the description of what Sayatet was teaching, which, describes certainly a lot of aspects of, for example, scanning the body, doing body scans. But the word, for example, the word Vedana wasn't used at all. It was all in the context of observing the elements within the body, and also that he, taught Anapana. I think at least for 5 days, and the focus was to get students to a point where they were experiencing what's called, I think, the counterpart sign, or nimitta, which is a stage of concentrate of, either deep access or jhana. And so I remember just being struck by reading that, and how that kind of sort of blew up this notion of, this sort of same pure and pristine practice that went all the way back, when it was really being augmented. It had really been already augmented from just, Sayagyi's teacher.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's what being in Myanmar starts to give you, those bits and clues to put together and to see where things were formulated, how they were kind of different, they were being presented. I think for me as well, I referenced how in an earlier podcast, after my second course, I just had all of these questions that I wanted to have answered, and talking to this teacher. And after several questions, he just kind of smiled and said, I think that you should maybe spend some more time on practice. I think that many of these questions will be answered by your own practice, and they'll be answered much more powerfully and effectively than if we sit down and talk about these. And it really had an impact on me, because at that point in my life, coming out of college at that time, I was really seeing the limitations of intellectual critical thought discussion, and that they're just kind of talking around the essence and the experience, and they're not actually getting at it. And that was a huge insight for me. And so him saying that really dedicated me to wanting to only talk in so much as to be able to make sure I was practicing the way I was supposed to be doing, and to not try to replace intellectual conversations or thinking with the actual practice, and really made me kind of hunker down into that. As Goenka says, intellectual games. This is the word he uses, is that don't engage in intellectual games. And this expression had great meaning to me, and feeling that. And I think for me, the danger was that I started to associate any intellectual thinking, study, reading, exploration, conversation, all of that to me became intellectual games that was apart from the core of the practice. And so that all kind of went out the window. And I think that, and I think also just the practice gives such good benefit. And so I think these things together, these conditions together give rise to being, first, not having access for most people of being able to go and investigate this further and get proper information, because this is being, much of this information is being quoted from a military dictatorship halfway around the world in a foreign language, where people have very little access to, travel and language and culture and politics and everything else. Those are huge barriers to get in the way. And so because of this, it becomes this perfect bubble where anything you say, or much of what is said, can kind of go unchecked. And even if you wanted to check it, there's this kind of prohibition against wanting to go too far in terms of engaging in this quote unquote intellectual games. And for me, this was, again, like at the time that I heard this, to not focus on these questions, but to focus more on the practice. This was exactly advice I needed to hear. This was in my mind, this was a very compassionate and wise teacher who was really helping me to focus on what I needed to focus on in that moment. The challenge for me is that I eventually got to a point, and I think many meditators get to a point, where the practice and the intellectual curiosity and critical thought needed to have some kind of balance. And for me, anytime some question of critical thought would come to mind, or intellectual exploration, I would dismiss that as intellectual games, which were irrelevant and didn't matter. And I just needed to go back to the practice itself. And so it was this kind of self-fulfilling cycle where I was, for these various conditions, both internal and external, I was constantly being swayed away from greater examination and just going repeatedly into the practice over and over, even when things weren't adding up. And when things weren't adding up the right way, I didn't even have the tools to be able to admit that or investigate it, because the only tools I had were going back to this, not just one teacher saying one thing many years ago, but really that statement was part of a greater organizational philosophy that you just keep going back to the practice. You just keep going back to the practice, which is beneficial in some context and some forms of advice, but it also kind of kept me stuck from, and living in Burma, where I was very, very different from most other meditators who weren't having access to this other kinds of information and experiences. Living in Burma, this ended up being just a lot to hold and digest and find a way to process.
Yeah, I can imagine. I can definitely imagine. And it sounds like you're speaking to, something I also experienced around just kind of compartmentalizing parts of
Right, right.
myself, and dealing with sort of a lack of integration in pieces. I think that sort of prohibition around questioning, or the emphasis on faith, or just going back to practice, ends up becoming sort of a justification for a certain prohibition to kind of question things more in the tradition, and to be more critically examining, or critically thinking around pieces of this. And initially I had those experiences at different times, and I noticed that I did have to compartmentalize when I did have questions. And then also when um, let me see, there's another angle of this also, which had to do with, both observing in myself, places where emotionally didn't, I wasn't giving myself permission to, around some of my emotions in regard to the practice. And I saw other students also doing the same. And that was concerning also on an integration level, right? But again, there's the message I kept getting was just, well, just going back to practice. But partly because I grew up in a psychologically sort of conversant environment. My father was a psychiatrist, so some of that didn't really resonate. But I kept noticing more and more that there was a kind of a lack of integration there. There was also, in some ways, an acceptance and a compassion for everyone, sort of, starting out where they were. Everyone has different conditioning, and I think Goenka's tradition as a culture recognized that. But I think there were ways in which it didn't avoid some of those pitfalls of what I later came to know as spiritual bypass, by countering that within the culture. That because again, there wasn't a culture of having open discussions, of critically examining things, of questioning sort of tenets, main tenets of the framework or tradition of the practice. And because of that, yeah, I came up against, I think, a similar conflict that you did, or a similar level of compartmentalization within myself that I wouldn't say had manifested, when I was in Myanmar, but had definitely begun there. I think, again, because I was experiencing a broader scope.
Right. And I think just the experience of being in Myanmar, it directly confronts you with a reality that is this living, thriving Buddhist community with its own history and its own traditions, and it's manifesting itself for all its different features, and both good and bad. And allowing the person there to experience it. And I think that for what I've seen in myself, as well as in other people who've come, is that if you're only there for a short time, this conflict between what you're being told and how it's being described and what you're actually experiencing can doesn't necessarily have to take shape. Things could be minimized, they could be argued, they could be unseen. Other interpretations can be given. There's all kinds of mental kind of tricks that can be done to be able to convince oneself that the framework one is coming in with which I would argue is Orientalist in some form, that framework that one is coming in with is in fact the correct one, and dismissing what is actually being seen and witnessed. That I think that for shorter periods of time, and by shorter periods of time, I don't just mean a couple days or weeks, I mean a month or even a couple months. I think that one can stay for longer in that time frame and really still hold on to this sense of this mindset one has that is able to override the reality that's existing there. But for me, and for those I've seen that have lived in the country longer and come, Western practitioners that have come, this kind of confrontation is really inevitable. And I think for me, I held on to parts of that mindset and that framing that I wanted to believe, and that when reality started to confront it, it was immensely and terribly difficult, because I didn't have the tools to know how to handle this divergence. And I had no one I can talk to. There was no one who had gone through anything that I knew of, anything like that before me. And obviously there were no books or no resources or anything else. And so it was really just a lot of internal stuff I had to hold. And sometimes I remember, as I was going through this period of trying to integrate this knowledge and understand what it meant, sometimes I would hold so tightly to what the Goenka tradition was telling me and what I wanted to believe in, that I would just simply deny the reality in front of me. I would, as I said, I would minimize it. I would explain it off in different ways. I would not see it. I might say that this is the way things should be. Any number of things to really hold on tightly to what I was saying. Other times I'd go the other way. I might swing the other pendulum. Other times I might be like, this is really happening here, and what I've been told is wrong, and it's like, it's a lie, and it's hypocritical, and what does this mean, and how do I hold this? And I really just didn't. It was this push pull that I didn't know how to manage the path that I was on. And as we talked about in this last podcast, where we were in our last discussion, we were mentioning how when this feeling that you were getting this massive benefit from this thing, this practice, unquestioned benefit from your life improving and your mind being clearer. And then you're also told that you're kind of one of the elite ones on the one correct path, and with a community of fellow practitioners. And it just feels great. I mean, it just feels great to know that you are doing the right thing with your time, and to have that challenged in the place where the origins of the technique came from was really, really hard to deal with. And I think one of the reasons that made it harder is that in the way that these teachings and the culture and the discussions are framed from the Goenka organization, it's very, very difficult to take one part, even a small part, and say, well, Goenka says this in one discourse, or this is a way this thing is framed, or this is a way this thing is understood. And to come up with factual or historical or documented evidence that this is not quite the case, that it's actually like this. It's very hard to hold that and continue to, at least for me it was, and continue to have the overall faith and reverence and everything else, because so much of the way I would argue that tradition is built is that, Goenka himself says there's nothing that needs to be taken away. There's nothing that needs to be added. He's saying that about Dhamma as a universal thing. But to go back to your conflation argument, I think what he's really saying, even though it doesn't come out and say this, I think what he's really saying is about his particular technique and tradition. In his particular technique and tradition, there's nothing that needs to be taken out. There's nothing that needs to be added. And so if I'm suddenly facing with my own direct experience something that does need to be taken out or something that does need to be added, not from my own opinion, but by evidence that is directly confronting something that I've been told, which cannot be true, to me, that how does that not question the heart of everything, given that the way the teachings and the tradition is constructed, that every part of it is integrative and connected, and and you can't just take one part out and then be okay with the other. At least that was the way I understood it. So it was just incredibly challenging to hold all this within.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember, when I look back at my two visits to Myanmar, I think of myself as holding a lot of arrogance, in terms of coming in contact with a culture that was really steeped in Dhamma, in a society, and yet kind of holding myself in some ways above that because I had this notion of practicing some pure and pristine version of the Dhamma, or being, much more committed to meditation as an expression of the Dhamma, and you know, and sort of, yeah, seeing that contradiction. I mean, even I think in the way that Goenka frames the whole notion of service, and conflates service in his tradition, because he talks about service, in a broad way, but really, in some ways, it's conflated with just serving at his centers, and yet, as we know, in the Buddhist tradition of developing paramis, just for example, generosity, dana, or renunciation. Those two right there are just such huge parts of the culture of Myanmar, right? And I remember actually you, when we first landed, you facilitated Carolyn and I going to a monastery and just giving, what I remember was just a huge amount of school supplies to the children that were being taught in the monastery, and just what an amazing act that was. And again, it was part of doing something in a Dhamma context. It was definitely an act of service. It was definitely an act of developing paramis, you might say, in that Buddhist framework. And yet I was aware that, just even a few years previous, or even maybe at that time, I don't know, but I would have to have kind of downplayed that experience, or somehow not brought that up, because that would be seen as somehow diverting, in regard to my relationship to the Dhamma. And so that kind of that holding, that sort of insularity of that, I began to have a perspective of feeling, that Goenkaji's tradition was insular to just this broad experience of Dhamma that had clearly influenced an entire country, an entire culture. That, yeah, I think similar to you, that was starting to begin to have some dissonance for me.
And I think for me as well, I had so much fear, really. And I think that sense of fear or paranoia, that I think that's something that is not uncommon to many meditators within this tradition, in a way it's not really talked about or even examined. And especially when you come to a place like Myanmar, that fear just manifested in so many ways. It was fear of contamination, or of losing the refined path that I was on. For example, the fear of other teachers. I remember one time meeting a monk who was so happy I was there and practicing, and I was happy to meet him. And I said, "What do you practice?" And he said, "Mahasi." And my immediate response was something like, "Okay, well, I don't want to know about that. I don't want to hear about that. I'm doing, this is the practice I'm doing, and I really think you should look into this." And so it was just this such an extreme fear of other traditions that I couldn't even have a conversation. And I remember actually one moment when some Goenka friends had come, and they were practicing for several months, and I happened to have a book written by Sayadaw U Tejaniya. And during our rest times, we were just hanging out at monasteries doing our own meditation. I said, "Oh, check this out. This has really helped me, this book." And a week later, I asked the girl who'd read the book, I said, "Well, what were your thoughts on this? How did you feel?" And she said, I really felt extremely uncomfortable, because the book had really good knowledge in it, and it made me think about things in a new way, but it wasn't coming from the Goenka tradition, which I'm used to. And it made me extremely uncomfortable, and anxious to get this information. And I had to stop reading, because I couldn't deal with it. And then her husband at one point in reading the same book, had decided that he was going to practice Anapana exactly the way Goenka taught, but he was going to practice it standing instead of sitting. And he reported the same thing. He said, this was really interesting to try, but because I was doing something out of the way I'd been taught, and this is the only way that you can practice, whatever benefit even as I got benefit from it, the benefit actually made me more anxious, and I had to stop doing it. I had fear of being of the religion, that I was told that I was practicing the Buddhist teachings, but I was not practicing Buddhism. And so I had great fear of doing anything that was labeled Buddhist or as part of Buddhism. I had fear of quote unquote rites and rituals. I didn't even know what they meant, rites and rituals, but I just had fear that suddenly I would be doing them, and that, that would also be taking me away from what the correct practice was. And I had fear of monks because this was not a monastic tradition. And I think the relationship with monks was very weird, I would say. From all accounts I've ever heard, Goenka, as a person, deeply, deeply revered monks. I've heard so many anecdotes and
Yes.
stories
Yes.
of how
Oh,
he held
yeah.
them. And so he,
Yeah.
personally, he held that. And yet there was also, this was a lay tradition, of course. It did not encourage going into monkhood, because if you went into monkhood, you wouldn't be part of the tradition. And so they'd lose members of the tradition. There was this kind of reverence tinged with suspicion kind of mixed in, where it was like, respect the monks and feel grateful for them, but also know that you're a little better than them because they don't really meditate. And if they do, they're probably not doing the right thing. And I
Right. Right.
recall
Yeah.
there was a very powerful moment I had in Australia, actually, where many, many years later, when I had lived in Burma a while, and I was at a Goenka center, and I was with a teacher who had spent a lot of time in Burma, not as nearly as much as me, maybe, the better part of a year in total. But we were sitting with a young Australian meditator who was serving his first course. And after a meal, because we're serving, so we can talk, he turned to us and said, "Hey, like, what, you guys have both been to Burma. Like, what's the difference between what I'm doing here as a meditator and all those monks in Burma?" And I just kind of like pause and take this deep breath. I'm like, man, that's a great question. Like, how do I want to answer this? Where do I want to go with this? And just kind of reflecting, what words do I want to choose to be able to contrast this? And before I can speak a word, the teacher next to me says, the monks in Burma are just kind of going through the rites and rituals and the religion. We're actually meditating. And the kid is just kind of like, "Oh, okay." And it was such an astounding moment. I sat there horrified. And I've thought about that moment so many times in my life, because like you, when I came to Burma, I was arrogant. I was closed. I had this Orientalist imagery that was preventing me from seeing things how they were. And I went through a lot of inner pain in the way I treated others and the way that I wasn't able to open up to what was around me. And I went through a lot of reflection on why was I like this? I don't think I'm naturally this kind of person. I'm naturally curious and open and respectful. And where did this arrogance come from? And I just didn't, where did this conditioning come from that closed me off so much like this? And when this incident happened, I was paralyzed, because I was like, oh my God, this is a replay of probably an exact conversation I had on the other side. And when I got this
Mm.
information, this was like the first step in my conditioning and my starting to think
Mhm.
about what I am and what other people are. And this is a
Mm.
fact which is unchecked and is coming from a source of authority and someone respected, and coming at a time when the person is open and receptive and receiving this great benefit and curious. And so this is going to go deep, deep inside in terms of, this is who I am and this is who the Burmese monks are. And then when this person starts to become more experienced in the organization, maybe just 3 or 4 courses, he's going to turn to another young server, having never been to Burma or not know anything, and answer the question in the same way. And so I'm watching a replay of this conditioning, which harmed me so much when I went in. And so that was, that's just a lot to unpack.
Yeah, yeah, and again, this sort of dissonance between what I mean. I went to many what are called sangadanas. In other words, lay offerings to monks and nuns with Goenkaji, and he did express this incredible deep reverence for for monastics. I traveled all throughout the U.S. and Sri Lanka with him as he did this, and so I know that there was almost kind of a bit of a mixed message around his example of that, and yet sort of the culture at large, or the how the leadership or representatives of the tradition created a lot of distance to monastics, or placed it within certain kind of boxes what that assistant teacher was describing as, all monastics just do rites and rituals and don't practice. Those were messages that I also received, and that became painful, I think, as I began to kind of question that arrogance. It was and kind of question, where did that come from? How
Mm.
do I have this cultural arrogance in this country? Um, you know, and so I want to just echo that, because it when I turned and looked at some of those attitudes that I also was sheltering and holding, it was painful to see the arrogance that I had kind of inherited somehow from within the tradition around looking askance or minimizing or dismissing other expressions and other experiences of the Dhamma, that were in some cases broader and deeper than my own. And so and I would say that really continued, once Carolyn and I, returned from Myanmar to the United States. We also, we faced also some huge life changes. We became pregnant and had a son, Julian, and our life radically changed in that moment, and that represented another piece of this, because up until that point, I think something else you're kind of articulating here, Joa, is that when you're as involved as you and I were, and in my case I was a representative, there's a real in. You're in. There's a level. Once I think you're sort of sitting long courses, and you've sort of declared a certain surrender to only practicing this practice, and only being devoted to Goenkaji as your teacher. You've stepped inside. You've stepped inside the tradition, and there is now an in and an out. And I think that's part of what the tension that you're describing, and the tension that I also felt, was kind of based on, that I didn't realize at the time. And maybe that's, as a representative, maybe that's just, normal, just like you'd experience that in any organization when you're representing that organization. But I think, again, that the inability, or the sort of cultural prohibitions around open discussions or questioning things, or that it contributes then to this sense of having to maintain that inness, and that if you somehow start to question that, you're going to somehow then you're no longer going to belong. So your sense of belonging also is wrapped up in that. And I think that's kind of what began to crack, definitely for Carolyn and I think, as we returned to the United States. And ironically, we were completing Carolyn's training as an assistant teacher at that time, and I can definitely talk to you more about just how those conversations then began to really evolve for us, where we were really looking more critically at what we saw going on.
Yeah, and to stay on Burma a bit for the time, and just examining, just unpacking what that experience was like. I think for me, as I was holding that tension, the tension was really centered on how much I'm holding on to what I want to believe and what I'm a part of, and how much I'm interacting with the reality that I'm being confronted with, and trying to understand it, which, let's be honest, understanding anything about Myanmar and Burmese Buddhism included is really hard. So it's not that it's just it's not that there's just something obvious in front of you that is plain as day. I mean, that's a whole other topic to go into, the vagaries of what Burmese Buddhism is and how it manifests and all the different forms of it. So that was also extremely complicated and challenging. But in whatever case, the extremely messy and complicated story of how Burmese Buddhism was manifesting was intersecting less and less with the mindset of what I'd been told from Goenka's message in coming there. And there was less and less intersection of between what I was believing and what I was experiencing. And that became increasingly hard to be able to understand. And that became a question of why why am I having such a struggle critically engaging with this material? And being able, just kind of giving myself the freedom to think. I mean, not talk, not write, not convince others, but just simply to think about it. And this is still my own inner journey I'm discovering and learning about. For me, I think, partly as I legitimately was getting a great benefit from the practice and the community as well. And so it was simply difficult to think about some of the more negative aspects or critical aspects of something that was still, getting a lot of benefit from in life. I think another question is where to look. As I mentioned, what resources do you have? There's really none I can think of that can really be a contrast to this. And then another one is this question of these intellectual games that there are, that go back to the practice. The practice is what is most important, and don't get lost in these other things that aren't going to serve you in the end. And so those things were very prominent in my mind. But as I started to critically examine, and I would, even just to hold the information that contrasted or conflicted, I would have a physical reaction. I would shake. I would have short breaths. I would start sweating. My head would get dizzy, and I would get confused what I was saying. This happened, and this still continues to happen. That's how strong these things were in me. And I know that's not the case with everyone. I know many people that can hear other versions of stories from what they've believed or what they've been taught and be like, oh, okay, that's cool. I know people that have stronger reactions than I do. So, there is this continuum. But just to give a concrete example, when I was in, when I visited the monastery that Lady Sayadaw set up in Monywa and started to learn more about the history, and learned like, okay, well, this building here is the oldest building on the site. All the other buildings are built, in last number of decades, but this one actually goes back, and this is the name of the building. This is the name in Pali, and what this is a Pali word which translates to walking meditation. And if you actually look at this building, it's kind of a part of it is this long narrow hall where he would practice his walking meditation. And so that's just that's one example of many, many, many facts that I was presented with. And, the first reaction is, oh my gosh, how cool. Like, wow. So he actually this great master actually practiced right here. And I'm in the same place and I'm learning this history. And when I practice, I can think of him. And, it's so great to get this information. But then as you go on, about what Goenka says about the value, or rather lack of value, of walking meditation. It's not taught, it's not encouraged, it's seen as something that is for people that, I think Goenka explicitly says this, that for people that are not as advanced and can't concentrate their minds, it's a good kind of baby step or beginner step. And here Lady Sayadaw has a building which the only way it's constructed that makes sense is that it was to practice walking meditation. I'm told he practiced walking meditation there. The name of the building literally means walking meditation. And so this is just flying in the face of what we're told about where the technique came from and what is being practiced. And yet when, to just take this one example, if I were to then tell someone about this building or this part of Lady's life, even if I wasn't in any way to make the connection, signifying what it meant that this was very different from what we learned, if I was just to state the fact in writing or in talking, just to say this was the name of the building, this is what the locals told me. And when I would do this, I would always be so careful to stick with fact, because I knew how difficult this was for me. I would not give any opinions. I would not make any connections. I would state the facts, and I would state my relationship with the facts in the sense that, like, I was here and this person told me this, and this is when I was here, trying to be as literal as possible. But even simply telling the facts of what I had learned about this building, and these details, I would go through physical reactions because I was putting something into the world that was undermining what I was told and what I believed to be of great value. And you could, of course, say, well, the technique still has value, and this doesn't mean that this one fact obviously doesn't mean that this benefit that I've had from practicing is not real or not valuable. It certainly doesn't mean that, but I don't know what it does mean. It certainly undermines something, and having the permission and the freedom to be able to think about first to recognize this is the truth, not to undermine or to reinterpret what this building was really for, because all evidence is clearly pointing to one thing. First of all, to admit that truth and not play those games. And then to take that truth and to share that just on its base value. And then after sharing it, to go into some kind of interpretation. What does this mean? Why was this told to me a different way? What reasons could that have been? What does it mean overall? The freedom to be able to explore and then critically think and examine, that was incredibly difficult for me, and something I struggled with for so many years. Just the freedom to think. And going back, I mean, I think the reason why I didn't have that I didn't give myself that freedom was just placing such value in the practice, in this feedback loop, that wasn't having this wider context, and just in getting benefit from that, and so not stepping outside to give myself permission to make this greater examination. And it's really hard.
Yeah, yeah, that's an amazing story about the walking meditation. I had a similar actually experience a little bit more recently when I was in a Dhamma study group with a number of assistant teachers and folks in the tradition, and we were reading the Majjhima Nikaya, and we actually came across the Pali word, and I think it's kankama, which actually refers to a practice of walking meditation. And it's also, I think it's related to a similar word for a walking terrace, right? So just what you're describing, like the actual structure is, and the purpose is for walking meditation practice. And there it is in the Pali Canon. And to have it so thoroughly dismissed in the Goenka tradition, it was another example of that dissonance that you're describing, and what began also that kind of critical, just saying, okay, wait a second, what have I swallowed here, and why can't I question it openly? Those things became more and more important to me. But I also began to sort of see both within myself a certain level of, this kind of, emotional compartmentalization, I guess, is the best way to talk about it. And I remember thinking, and seeing it also in others, in the tradition, and seeing it also in some of the dysfunctions that I was experiencing as an assistant teacher, working with other, committees or, groups that, initiatives that I was involved with. And I, at some point I began to and I remember writing to a full teacher, an acharya, about this. As I saw it in myself, as I saw it in others, I said, how can such a transformational, effective, remarkable, in my mind, miraculous in terms of what I had experienced in my life. How can such a practice result in this compartmentalization, this kind of, such kind of a limited sort of mindset and culture that I was experiencing. And, I realized that was also, I had inherited that. It was inside me. I was experiencing that as well. The arrogance was also mine. I began to kind of, experience, the fundamentalism that's sort of behind attitudes around, no walking meditation. It's not allowed. It's not, it's inferior practice. Those kind of attitudes, I began to see as a form of fundamentalism within the tradition. And that really, as I began to see, I was like, wait a second, how can this practice, which I have, ascribed to as such a pure and pristine practice, how can it be resulting in these kinds of results or these kind of outcomes, both inside myself and in others? And I remember writing, I don't know if I have it right in front of me, this letter, and if I could just read it, it's just a small sentence. I said, I said to the, acharya that I was writing to, I said, to be straightforward, I see a lot of fundamentalism, over rigidity, repression, lack of emotional awareness and integration, conflict avoidance, or avoidance of the uncomfortable, emotional bypassing, a lot of absolutism in the dogma, that spiritual arrogance, a sense of institutional isolation. I felt that increasingly that I was kind of alone in this tradition, that there was an insularity to it, and a sense of superiority, like that I was just increasingly uncomfortable with. And yeah, and then also, at this same time, we referred to this earlier, but I also began to was, because of some workplace situations, I was really examining anti-racism, but I was looking at, my own bias as a white male, and I was just noticing that, there was a lot of unexamined racism in the organization. And really, as much as all the kind of talk was about eschewing Goenkaji as a guru, I just was perceiving it, particularly because by this time he was really declining. He may have even passed by this time in 2013. There was a lot of gurudom that I felt was manifesting. So I described all this to a senior teacher, full of charya in the tradition, and was grappling with it. Was really grappling with that.
So yeah, I mean that anti-racism stuff really connects back to some of the other things we were talking about with the Dhamma brothers, and moves forward into some of the initiatives you took and some of the ways that you've changed. Before we get into that in full, and maybe what I'm about to say will also relate in some kind of side tangent way, or just sharing some similar characteristic. But I think going back to the Orientalist view, I think that one of the things that defines Orientalism is that it's more of like a fantasy or a mythology that exists within the mind of the person who's holding it, and they're holding it for a very specific reason. It feels good, or it fills some gap, or it explains something, or it gives them some kind of privileged status or something. But this Orientalist outlook is serving some point in the mind of the person who's holding it. But to hold the Orientalist kind of frame of reference and mindset, one has to be holding on more to the mythology that you're believing than the things that you're experiencing. That's really one of the definitions of that. And I didn't really know much about Orientalism before I came to Myanmar. I'd studied it somewhat in university, but when I started to learn more about Orientalism, and specifically how it related to India and Burma, I was really alarmed and amazed by how much it seemed to align with what I was seeing of foreign meditators coming over. And certainly in my mind, realizing that I was very much guilty of wanting to hold on to this picture that served me in some ways, rather than this messy, confusing reality that I was confronting. That was obviously much harder. And wanting to question why I was doing this, why I was holding on to something in my mind rather than what I was witnessing and what was before me. I think the really tragic thing about this Orientalist argument that the military coup in Myanmar exposed to me, and I don't want to speak blanket statements. I want to express, before I say what I'm going to say, I want to express tremendous gratitude to hundreds of meditators who have supported this platform, who have given so generously to humanitarian missions that Better Burma runs. There have been, we couldn't have done this without the meditator supporters that have followed us and that have supported our mission, and that have opened their hearts to what's going on in Myanmar and have given selflessly and continuously. It's just been tremendous. So I don't want to say any blanket statements, and want to foreground what I'm saying with that appreciation, with that acknowledgement of truth. That being said, for many people, I think many people with a Buddhist background, a meditative background, I don't think this is limited to the Goenka organization, but because that's what we're talking about, it's more prescient and more relevant to our conversation, but it's certainly not limited to that. But I think that when Myanmar started to go through the enormous problems it was going through with the military coup, and just the horrors and the atrocities and the things that just curl your blood when you hear them, or traumatize you just by knowing about what happened. And here is this living and breathing society that is suffering so much and needs so much support. And for many people that were constantly, people, teachers, meditators, organizations that were constantly talking about this debt of gratitude to Myanmar, and this is where the teachings came from, and this is what we owe them. I think that those words in many cases turned out to be utterly meaningless and empty because nothing was done, absolutely nothing, but on the part of many, many. Of course, there are many exceptions to that. As we said, this is not a blanket statement, but I don't think one can walk away from seeing the response, and again, not just from the Goenka organization, but also from many of the other meditative traditions, and just feeling just a failure, just a shame of how little these great platforms, which are built on the teachings that came from Myanmar, and this expression of gratitude is always being expressed, how little those stood by Myanmar as they was going through its darkest times, whether it was through financial support or moral support or whatever initiatives one can do within one's own practice and tradition and anything else, not to step outside and suddenly become an activist, but in line with how with whatever one's organization or practice was, how little Myanmar was regarded by so many people that were of these traditions. And for me, this served as kind of a really tragic evidence of this Orientalist standpoint, because if
Yes.
you
Yeah.
if you see if you hold an Orientalist view, and of course you can talk about when times are good, you could talk about the reverence, you could talk about the brotherhood, you could talk about the gratitude and the friendship and everything else, but really this is just a story that makes you feel better about yourself and your practice. My practice came from the jungles of an exotic place in Burma so many centuries ago, and that's what makes me and my practice special. And so it becomes another mark of this Orientalist fantasy and vision that is just justifying someone in a more privileged place and why they have, something that is more unique and better than everyone else out there. If you holding this Orientalist fantasy, it prevents one from actually interacting with the humanity and actually seeing these are real people, and these are people with their flaws and their benefits. These are people that I have a connection to, that I can relate to, I can learn about, I can hold space for them. Having if you're doing those kinds of, if you're interacting on those kinds of levels, then you're probably not holding on to much of this Orientalist myth, because you're seeing these people in their full shades of humanity and you're standing by them and you're bearing witness. But if you're not able to do that and you're just waiting for the bodies to fall and to be cleaned up and to either move back into a democracy or a dictatorship, whichever else, and then once there's some degree of safety, saying, "Oh, I'm off for my pilgrimage. I'm off for my meditation center. The bodies are cleared off the street, so I can go." If there's this mindset that this country and people in practice are playing this role for you, you're caught and you're mired in this Orientalist fantasy where you're not able to see the people as they are. But for those that are able to really witness that full humanity and continue to interact and stand by, it doesn't have that hold. But that, unfortunately, that has really been the minority of the case from what I've seen.
Yeah.
And so to me, this is just the tragic evidence that for so many, they were really holding Myanmar not as a people and something to really witness and interact with and learn from, but something as an Orientalist fantasy, which just further served their own sense of privilege and elitism.
Right, and you bring up I think, well, a lot of different aspects here that I'm moved to talk to, and I want to, first off, I just want to also just give you a shout out for the work you are doing with Better Burma. I mean, as someone who has been, again, I lived there for a year, lived and worked there for a year, and that was a significant experience for me. And as someone who did spend that much time in Myanmar, what you've done on behalf of the country is just, you've done so much in terms of bringing aid. And I just, I personally just want to thank you publicly
Thank you.
for that, because
Mm.
it's been so moving to me to just to watch you and watch how much you've really in so many ways just sacrificed so many aspects of your life to do that work. So just thank you for that. And yeah, and I think when you talk about Orientalism, I think one thing that's helpful for me to understand is that Orientalism is a form of it's colonial bias, right? And in some ways shares, which really comes down to racism, right? To a form of racist bias, right? And I think that's important because it's invisible, right? It's invisible in the way that it manifests in, for example, me as someone who lives and was brought up in the West and was brought up to view developing countries like Myanmar that were subjugated by colonial forces, like the UK, and so there's a lot of blindness there, and I am experiencing that blindness even now in our conversations. I'm so aware of what I don't know regarding that kind of bias, but I know because it's very similar to the kind of bias that is involved in institutional racism, that the colonial attitudes are very, very similar, and that they remain unless you look at them in a very intentional way, they remain unexamined. And I can speak to just the fact that 25 or 30 years of meditation didn't touch any of that for me. That I needed to initiate another whole process from on a cognitive learning level. I had to really educate myself to really come to terms with what my own racial bias was and is that I'm still working on, and to understand that also, when I would go to countries like India and to Myanmar, which had been subjugated by colonial forces for so long, that I was also operating in those same ways and would look, like you say, through an Orientalist viewpoint or a colonial viewpoint, and that and how important it is to, as I think, as meditators, to undergo a process of examining those biases, both implicit and explicit, and I think that I was told over and over again within the Goenka tradition that that work is separate from the Dhamma, and social justice work is separate from the Dhamma, and and that even other aspects of service in the world were not as valuable or legitimate as directly serving Goenkaji's centers, in terms of the so-called field, what is referred to as the field of merit, in terms of supporting folks who are doing the work of insight and liberation, and so I inherited again all of those attitudes, and I began to feel like I couldn't, that there was no place for that. I had a conversation with an Acharya, and I was told, he told me, well, the Dhamma organization is not going to do everything, for your life. The Goenka tradition is focused on these retreats. But I appreciated that at the time. I realized, okay, yeah, maybe I'm looking for too much out of this tradition and out of this organization. But then on the other hand, this, Goenka tradition was talking about the Dhamma, which is really one's entire life, right? It's sort of like that story of, Ananda and the Buddha, where Ananda says, friendship is half of the spiritual life. And the Buddha questions, says, no, what are you talking about? You don't say that, friendship is the whole of the spiritual life, right? And I had that same feeling about, my involvement in a Dhamma tradition, that it's there to inform and guide my entire life, not just pieces of it, right? And that included how I am in the world, how I'm conditioned as a white person, as a white male. And so, as I began to question all those pieces, I found myself, I think, as you're describing, sort of increasingly at odds with my sense of belonging to the organization. If that kind of echoes a little bit of what you were just describing.
Yeah, and I think what makes this also challenging to have to think through is that it's really interesting, your use of the word conditioning, because you're talking, conditioning can be used in different contexts. Just now you were talking about conditioning in the context of your conditioning by American society as a white male with privileges and having certain things invisible to you, certain things unseen. I mean, we're talking about the unseen in Buddhist Burma. This is the unseen in America of other experiences by other people, particularly of color, that are not having your experience, and you're conditioned to not see that or feel that. And yet this word conditioning is a very important word in the Buddhist context, or for those that that don't like that word, the meditative context of practicing the Buddhist teachings, that that condition, that this practice of meditation is deconditioning. This is something you hear all the time, and it's to large degrees true, that you are interacting with the depths of certain habit patterns, where you're actually seeing the base level of those habit patterns starting to form, and you can get in there and change that. And that's where, to me, that's where the miracle comes from. That's where the amazement that one can actually change one's life in ways I never thought possible by this tech, by Goenka's technique, particularly in my case. Other people have surely have had experiences with other techniques where they felt the same. But for me, with the technique of Goenka, to be able to get in there and see how this deconditioning could happen in ways I never thought possible in the world, it was nothing short of a miracle. And yet you're using the word conditioning to talk about uh, in the context of examining certain social constructs and ways that you behave. And I think herein lies the challenge of talking about this, because if we would have had this conversation 10 years ago, I would have launched into a very confident discourse that whatever conditioning you think you need to do in the world, all of that will be taken at the base level through the practice of meditation.
Right.
And yeah.
And I would have had that too. I would have had that too. And that became at some point kind of untenable to me, because I was, I was undergoing anti-racism training and affinity groups where I was being challenged to really examine the conditioning of my whiteness. And I was struck. It was so, it was literally, I'll just use the word, it was literally enlightening to me. It was so eye-opening, right? And it was so also so transformative and so profound to me, and so also deeply moving, both in understanding the pain of that conditioning, as well as the promise of potentially possibly coming out of it, although that's a tall order, of course, but increment, step by step. But that work, which I was doing obviously at not at a cognitive level of meditation, but at a social level of both education and reflection and examination of behavior, and that became as profound as some of my earliest courses in the Dhamma, right? And I was struck by that level of transformation, and I had to say, well, wait a second here. How is it that my meditation has never touched these layers of social construct conditioning of my society and of my race, or of the so-called construct of my race as a white person? And that question really loomed large and still, still an examination. But I began to see that that the Buddha himself addressed it, and addressed it with his with students at the time, even prior to teaching them meditation, even prior to them taking refuge. He was leading, groups of Brahmin students through a questioning process of their conditioning and their superiority and their sense of purity as Brahmins. And this is recorded 2,600 years ago in the Pali Canon, and it is so you just can't, that notion that you can separate out this type of reflection process, which the Buddha was engaging with his students prior to even them taking refuge in him, or in the teaching, or in the Sangha, and prior to them being taught this meditation practice. He was leading them through that kind of deconstructing process, right? At a cognitive level, at a reflective level, and so that to see the kind of the holding on to these limits of where the Dhamma could be applied and where it couldn't, just seemed very arbitrary to me.
And I think that that's to end on that note and pick up from that, that this question of where the Dhamma can be applied or not, that's exactly where I was going to go next. Is that I think in the way that Buddhist teachings have been delivered in, again, in this postmodern era where it's called modern Buddhism or Protestant Buddhism. These are terms that academics use to talk about how this new way that is disseminating the teachings that are based more on logic and health and reason and taking out some of the more phantasmical elements. A feature of this kind of methodology, which Goenka certainly falls into among many others, is that it becomes a kind of panacea for being able to fix and resolve everything. And so your question of like, where can the Dhamma fit in and where can't it? I don't know exactly how you put it, but where can you apply it? And where maybe should you apply other things? I think this kind of flies in the face of this presentation as it was happening during this period and by teachers such as Goenka, where it was really this panacea to be able to fix everything, to resolve everything, that any ills in life, all of it can be resolved this way, not through all this convoluted intellectual entertainment or things that, endless conversations or thinking that don't go anywhere, repeated habit patterns. Everything, all of these human ills that can be solved, it can all be boiled down to, and then fill in the blank. In Goenka's case, it'd be observe your sensations. And with other techniques, it might be something else. I think that new teachers are coming off now, or when I hear their methodologies, I don't see them doing this. It's quite interesting. I feel like we're getting more refined approaches in many cases where we're not getting this sense that this is a practice or teaching which can cover and fit and fill everything. But I think this also goes into what I was saying earlier in the conversation of why it was so difficult for me to give myself permission to examine very obvious shortcomings and contradictions that I was experiencing in Myanmar from what I had been told, because to accept the power of these teachings and the tradition that I was in was to accept these teachings as a panacea that was able to kind of be a fix-all for everything. And if I need to admit that there is something that it's not doing, especially in terms of conditioning, if you're to tell me that there is a deep-rooted conditioning in my mind that no matter how much meditation I do, it might not get to it, how am I supposed to take that information? Like, how is that not supposed to break down my entire worldview of what this practice is meant to be?
Right, and I think I think it's important to sort of describe actually that Goenkaji places a very preeminent emphasis, right, on a couple of words that I think are important to understand in regard to his teaching. One of them is the word sampajanya, and the other one is I think you've referred to as sensation or vedana, and those take on really a great emphasis, I think, within the teaching. And just to describe what those mean, Goenkaji translates Vedana as physical sensations. And although he acknowledges that they are categorized as one aspect of the mind, in terms of his practice, that the emphasis is on observing physical sensations within the body, understanding their impermanence, and developing equanimity towards those sensations, which then initiates a kind of a surfacing process or a purifying process by which underlying tendencies of impurities, of wrong views, or of negative emotions will then be able to surface. And as long as you continue to observe, that the anicca, the impermanence of those sensations, and with equanimity, that process of purification will continue to ever subtler levels of purification and liberation until one day you will experience the ultimate level of liberation, or nibbana. And so that word sampajanya typifies, although sampajanya actually has several other meanings, he chose to sort of focus on that definition of the word sampajanya and that definition of vedana as, in terms of the emphasis on physical sensations. And those become, that process becomes paramount to the exclusion of working with other types of more cognitive practices that the Buddha did teach, that are throughout the Pali Canon, throughout it all, all the suttas that he's taught, where he taught processes of substitution. So if you sense that you were full of craving, he would substitute that with the practice of metta or loving kindness, or actually a process known as turning away from unwholesome states, or of cultivating wholesome states, either metta, loving kindness, karuna, compassion, mudita, sympathetic joy, and so you can use the cultivation of those states, or even the cultivation of deeper aspects of concentration as a way of uprooting unwholesome states. And so, but Goenkaji really doesn't. Those other pieces, those other frameworks are not really. They're not. They're not allowed really, or given much. They're the only time that I think they're allowed is when you're actually struggling in meditation. They're not allowed as a normal way, and the preeminence again of this sort of purification process of sampajanya, and of the the definition of physical sensations with Vedana take take a sort of a preeminence, right? And so I began to, as I began to do this work around anti-racism, which is largely cognitive but really very profound at looking at aspects of my own conditioning all the way throughout my entire life. I thought, wait a second, how can this how can we just be just focusing so much and giving so much emphasis to the exclusion of other types of practices that the Buddha taught? And that became also a questioning process that I started down and began to see that was part and parcel of, I think, what was creating some of the dissonance that I was actually experiencing in the organization, or in the attitudes that were not allowing for critical thinking, or that would emphasize, oh, you should just practice and just do your work on the cushion, and everything else you just will take care of itself, And so those kinds of prescriptions were not working anymore for me.
As you say this, I'm to play devil's advocate. I'm thinking of a fellow meditator, a friend of mine, who, when we were talking about this at one point, he was saying, "Well, I acknowledge that there's racism in the world, and I'm saddened by it, and I definitely think it's a bad thing, but it's not my fight. I have a very short time on this world, and I have to practice very ardently, and there are many social ills and many problems that are happening around. And if I start spending more time on those, then that's going to be the thing I do, balanced with this kind of striving for spiritual liberation. And basically, like, I don't want to waste any of the time that I have available to be able to practice the most seriously I can and the most effective technique, and to make the most progress at being able to come out of these defilements. And so for this life, this is not really my cause to participate in. I applaud those who do, but this is not really for me. My path is this one." So I'm sure you must have heard some variation of that before. What do you think when given your work and your progress, what do you think when you're confronted with something like that?
Well, and I had those attitudes myself, right? I had those attitudes myself. That's why it was so jarring to suddenly, as I underwent the reflective work of anti-racism, and to look at my own biases and my own internalized racism and my own internalized dominance, and to see those states in me, how upsetting that that was, and how confrontational that was within myself. So I fully understand that, and I think it's important to realize that it's a both and equation. That deep practice goes hand in hand with integrating practice, and I think there's a lot of stories where folks may have even experienced deep level, deep levels of liberation, and yet, still had to, still have to learn ways of being in the world. Even as a Dhamma teacher, you have to learn the skills of teaching, right? That doesn't come just from being liberated. And so I think that in some ways that um, uh, I think that attitude is somewhat limited. Really, I would say that that's limited. I think having that, at one point in my life, that having that priority for myself, I would say that it was, now looking back on that I was not in touch with a certain level of my own humanity, maintaining that attitude that I should just strive and strive and strive for liberation, without taking other steps to integrate those pieces into my life. And I think that it's short-sighted to polarize those, to put those on as in two different departments. I think that the process of liberation is in fact a process of recovering our humanity, and I see those, especially in the states of the Brahma Viharas of loving kindness, of compassion, of sympathetic joy for others and for ourselves, and equanimity. Those are states those are integrating states. Of course, they are also states to develop, very intensely in terms of concentration and but they are also states of integrating into the world. And I think to just strive, thinking that by liberating yourself with certain types of practice and not attending to other parts of yourself, I think that's actually short-sighted. And I saw that in myself. I saw that I was limited, and that I had, in some ways, really kind of utilized that attitude almost as a kind of to maintain a certain, you might say, superiority in terms of my own path, or supremacy in terms of my own path, and prioritizing that over other aspects of being human and being in the world, and being compassionate with others, and understanding the context, the social context of oppression and racism, and how it manifests. It's everywhere. And I think to just ignore that, and say that you're just going to liberate yourself is, it's to me, it's a limited, for me, it was a limited perspective in myself. I'll just leave it at that.
Right. So that would be one response to the. I say devil's advocate, but actually that's probably not a correct term to use it, because it's not theoretical. It's not something I'm inventing. It's something that many people believe, and I'm citing one very specific conversation I had where I'm trying to relay as authentically as I can how it was framed to me. The other response, I think, and we've gotten into this a little bit, but to treat it more directly, while some people might say, well, this is good for people who do that, good on those that want to take this cause. My life is short. I have limited time and resources. I'm going to spend it on the spiritual path. You've responded to that. The other thing that people might bring to the table is, I am doing a process and a meditation which deconditions habit patterns and blind reactions at a core depth beyond what any other practice or thing in the world can do. And so this conditioning that you're talking about, it's something I'm going to face, and I'm going to uncover take out the roots in a way that that will be far more effective than any of these kind of like surface, psychological or dialogues or readings or anything else. I'm really going to work at a depth of this. So when you hear this kind of response, not pushing aside or minimizing the existence of this habit pattern, but rather insisting that this is the practice which is going to decondition it, because that's what we're told. This is by many meditation practices today, that this deconditions everything. What is your response when you hear something like that?
Well, and I heard that from, full acharyas in the Goenka tradition over and over again, was the sense that, if you work at the root level, all this other stuff is going to ultimately get taken care of, and I don't have to do that work. But here they were in charge of an organization and tradition where there was structural and institutional racism occurring in the way that students of color could expect to enter into the organization, to be able or not be able to do service, to be able or not be able to be in a position based on how much they sat or served, to be considered to be an assistant teacher or some other representative position in the organization. And this is where I think those blind areas around institutional racism and structural racism come into play, because clearly an entire organization had come up with those biases in place. And yet the leaders of the organization were telling me, after 40 years of their own meditation at the deepest levels, according to what they were describing and according to what Goenka was prescribing, that they didn't have to do that work. And so I just couldn't, I just don't buy that. And I couldn't buy that. And I couldn't buy being a representative in the organization without taking steps to try and, shift those. And so one of the first things I did, because another full teacher and I were beginning to do, take some anti-racism workshops together. And we realized just how profound this was. He actually had grown up in another country where there was a different context around racism and than the U.S. context. And so we wanted to bring this to the local assistant teacher group where we live. And so we created a kind of a one-day workshop around how important it was to understand just simple aspects of everyday racism, for example, or everyday bias like microaggressions, and what kind of attitudes, and what may also be surfacing in the minds of our students of color on their retreats as they're doing such a deep sort of, what was called an operation of the mind, a deconditioning process, that they may be surfacing aspects of their experience of everyday racism, and is there a place of safety to acknowledge that, or a knowledge, a base of knowledge and capacity to feel those kinds of concerns from the dais, from the teacher's seat. And so we conducted this workshop, but it actually met with a lot of resistance. And I mean, so there was certainly some receptivity, but it was kind of like, okay, that was a one and done thing. And, there was no support to continue it. And, I understand from doing this work, it's very delicate work. It's very upsetting work. It's work that involves actually having to look at all, certainly I'll just speak for myself, my own participation, right, in cultural and structural racism, and how blind I am to it, right? So that's not easy work to do. It's upsetting work, and that was the case, and yet it's similar. You might say it's quite similar to the uprooting that happens when you sit to meditate and you look at your own, false perceptions or illusions or underlying tendencies around craving and aversion. Those are, in my book, those are very parallel. That the conditioning is very parallel in the way that we've internalized different types of conditioning, right? So to me, it's relevant work, but I saw that there was a lot of, kind of organizational and institutional resistance to that work being done. And that was hard for me. That was hard for me as a representative of the tradition.
Yeah, it also makes me, hearing this, it makes me reflect on some of the experiences I had that I described, where I was encountering elements within Myanmar of things that confronted the story that I was told about what this meditation is supposed to do for me and where it comes from, and this wider context. And because everything was so wrapped together in terms of the messaging. There was nothing you can take out. There was nothing you could put back in. That a challenge to one part of it was, to me, a challenge to everything. And I saw that as well with when I would bring these examples of things I was finding, right down to the building where Lady say I did walking meditation. It was difficult to talk about just simply basic facts of history or basic things I was confronting, because they were at odds with what everyone knew was being said on the discourses over and over and again, and the instructions, and just the culture as well, and everything else. And so it became difficult to talk about this, because even if you were only going to talk about one point, that one point was really a microcosm of starting to say, well, how could anything else be true if this part is not working? And that goes back to the way that things are presented. It's presented in this real overarching remedy for all of humanity's ills. And if there is one of humanity's ills that this technique does not rescue or cure or uproot, then suddenly that messaging is wrong. And if that messaging is wrong, what do we say about the whole thing? That becomes very problematic. And so I wonder if, in your questioning and confronting about some of the things you were finding with institutional racism, and trying to uncover how many years of practice had, in this case, not deconditioned this, in some sense, you're not just talking about an organization that needs to look at better managing diversity and things like that. But that's a big topic in and of itself, and a very important topic. But are you not also getting at this topic that somehow this technique is not doing what it is what is constantly being purported that it must be doing, and therefore
Exactly.
that
Yeah.
conversation becomes very problematic, dangerous, tense, and unsteady?
Yeah, Joe, you're hitting, you're hitting the nail on the coffin here. I mean, it's really spot on, and that was that. You talked about shaking. I think when you were describing having some of these thoughts, questionings yourself around the shaking that would happen. Well, when I began to actually question the practice, I realized that I was questioning something that was unquestionable, and that was so sacrosanct and a given that I was really putting my own sense of belonging to the organization in question. And yet I felt felt I needed to do that. And I remember, in response, again, because I was having conversations with both my wife Carolyn and another acharya, on a weekly basis we were just kind of lamenting some of the aspects of the dysfunction in the organization, the emotional bypass, a lot of the history of just kind of mishandling situations on a more emotionally integrated way, and um, and and yet for me it kind of came down to the emphases in the practice as in fact kind of creating that bypass, that there were that this split in some ways between, um, if I can describe it as, just more cognitive level reflective work, um, and then seeing how those kind of more cognitive level, or you might say grosser levels of reflective work, were also replete through the Pali Canon. Those practices are there, which are much more contemplative, you might say, or like I say, cognitive rather than sort of metacognitive, and this notion that doing this deep sort of purification work at the unconscious level was going to do everything, was not going to cut it. And, I remember, in Goenka's discourses, he gives this notion of, uprooting, cutting the roots of these defilements. And I fully agree that that's necessary, but he makes that sort of exclusive, or he says, if you spend all your time, pruning the trees, you're not going to deal with the
Mm.
roots. But I think it's, again, I came to this place where it's really a both and proposition, not an either or. and that the emphasis, as you say, this purporting that doing it at this unconscious level of purification level only was going to solve all of it, and became less and less. I saw it as actually causing a lot of the sort of dysfunctional attitudes, the mindsets, the compartmentalization that I was experiencing and seeing in other people's, the suppression, the kind of adherence to rigidity, and the way that students, I would see newer students striving with their practice, that, all of those pieces I began to see as coming out of this overemphasis at this sort of metacognitive level, and that you need that integration. You need the both and. You need practices that are also cultivation, that are also reflective, that are contemplative, that are working maybe on more cognitive aspects of using opposites, or turning away from all these things that are in the Polyganon, and that describe a much broader ways of working that the Buddha also taught. And so I was suddenly sort of, I was being more and more confronted with that, the limits of that, and the kind of, the dissonance of it.
Right. And I think we're getting to about the end of this current session, but what all that makes me think, where all this comes together, the looking at where the technique came from in the Polycanon, looking at the anti-racism analysis and perspective that you were bringing, looking at some of the things I was confronting with Burmese history and Burmese Buddhist culture and monasticism that was diverging for me. These three are extremely different fields, and yet where they come together for me is this question of how we examine and talk about this given the context of the messaging that came. And to do this, I mean, what is it? There's no other way to say it really than, I guess you have to go back in and unpack the big man's message, the big man meaning Goenka, that there are certain things that he sets down for whatever reason. And that's a whole other element to go into, is the reasonings behind some of the decisions that he made, and the way he set things up and the way he presented them, given the context of the times, his background in psychology and where he was coming from, what he was trying to achieve, whatever the reasons for why he did what he did, that's one element. But the fact is that he did them, and that this dynamic and this rhetoric is there. It is something that's present. And so as far as this kind of, what's the word I want to use? This confident and all encompassing and optimistic, and this statement of certainty that comes to describe everything from, I mean, these are just three of many, many things we could talk about, how it references Burmese history, how it references the Polycanon, and what it does and does not do in terms of honoring diversity and making it inclusive and welcome for all, as well as how it, on a wider scale, what that's a microcosm of, how it's being able to respond to all various kinds of conditioning and where it doesn't. The problem, as I see it, is that, I mean, in many ways, I have a lot of sympathy for those that are in leadership and representatives of the organization, is they have this really unequivocal, very strongly worded message that is going back to this remedy for all of the ills that plague humanity, and presenting a streamlined version of history, both going back to the Buddha's day as well as its travels through Burma, and is presenting something where there's really, in some ways, there's really no wiggle room. It's really this defining message that not only defines very clearly what the technique is and why the technique itself is of the utmost value, but also the culture and the context and the methodology surrounding that particular technique. And so whenever you start to get into these other elements that we're talking about, these examples that we're going into, even when one doesn't have the intention of wanting to present a challenge or to call something out or to do damage or whatever, you're just simply referencing something from your life, it comes into contact with this unwavering message of confidence that simply doesn't have any ability to be able to maneuver and to be able to negotiate and to be able to critically think about it and to examine, because it just is. And so being a member of that organization, especially a member of standing, I don't know how you honestly or critically take in these kinds of arguments and statements where you're also allowing an examination of these things which are not to be questioned and not to be looked at.
Right.
And so I don't
Yeah.
know where you go with that.
Well, and that's, yeah, and I think we're describing a moment here where that confrontation was, really erupting. And in some ways, I became, through different folks who I was speaking with, you included, of course, at the time, was I was confronting several boxes that were not to be questioned.
Mm.
And again, I'll mention what those boxes were, but again, I was still in a place where I was so ideal. Like, I've never lost sight and still don't, about the transformational part of this practice,
Mm-hmm.
so to be questioning it at
Yeah,
this
yeah,
level was very
yeah,
disturbing,
yeah.
because it was so, that certitude that you are describing, it was coming from a place of just incredible idealism
Mm.
and a sense of purpose and a sense of mission in my own world as well, both internally and externally, of being a teacher in the tradition. And so, yeah, the boxes that I was coming up against that I didn't feel like I could question were, one, the box of the teacher, of Goenka himself. I didn't feel like there was room to question how, his positioning in the organization. There were so many aspects of it that were not questionable. The other box was the practice, the technique, the vipassana as taught by S.N. Goenka, in the tradition of Sayagyi Bakin. That practice was considered sacrosanct. You could not question the tenets of that practice, right? So that was another box that I felt that I was, struggling with. And then two other boxes were the organization and the sort of, the sense of tradition and the culture and the mindset of that, of, you might say the tenets of the organization, but even the way the organization held itself as, in some ways, its own. It held a kind of a purity about its mission, right? About its standing in the Buddhist world, about its, okay, let's take out the word Buddhist, but as a harbinger of the second sasana, the pure Dhamma. There were so many aspects of that, of the organization, the tradition, and the tenets of that, and the mythology,
Mm.
the history of that, which I would say is almost its own
Yeah.
box. The chain of teachers, this unchanged practice. Those were two other boxes that I felt like I couldn't question, and yet inside I was uncovering, inaccuracies or incongruities that, in fact, the evidence was that I needed to question it. And so that presented itself, and this was, again, this was beginning, I'll go back to, 2014, 2015. So yeah, about 8 years ago, 8, 9 years ago, and there was still a lot ahead of us, in terms of how I thought, okay, well, maybe as a representative, because I was, yeah, as these discongruities were surfacing, I said, well, okay, what can I do in my role as a representative, because that role was becoming more and more uncomfortable for me.
Mm. Yeah, well, I think that's probably at the 2 hour mark here. That's probably a great place to leave off. A great to be continued.
Well, great, Joe. I really appreciate this, and yeah, I'm just loving our conversation. So thank you so much, and to be continued.
Many of you know that in addition to running the Insight Myanmar podcast platform, we also formed a nonprofit, Better Burma, to respond to the terror that the Burmese military has been inflicting on the country and its people. We encourage listeners to check out our blog to see what work Better Burma has been carrying out, along with the upcoming projects we hope to support. Right now, as I'm sure you all know, and today's interview only reinforced, that the ongoing need is overwhelming. A donation of any amount goes towards those vulnerable communities who need it most, and it will be so greatly appreciated. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam